Welcome back to another DEAP podcast. I'm D,
And I'm Cast.
and today we're going to be talking about quarantines. Now, it should be noted that while we're recording this, it's in the middle of the COVID-19 self-isolation section of the quarantine, so keep that in mind. We'll be including that in our discussions here. But I figure we'll start off with a quick history on the word quarantine and where it comes from. Quarantine is from a Italian word quarantina, which means 40 days. And basically in Venice and other ports of Italy, when ships were coming in the anywhere between the 1300s and the 1700s, they would if they are suspected of carrying disease, they would have to wait 40 days before having the people on board come ashore. And that was to prevent the disease from being spread from one port to another port. So that's where it comes from. And it seems like that's kind of where we're going, is about 40 days of not interacting with each other.
Yep, the majority of the U.S. is currently under about a month or a little bit over a month of self-isolation. The majority of the states in the U.S., at least.
Right, which self-isolation is kind of a form of quarantine, but it's basically saying, hey, you should quarantine yourself, and it's not a government-enforced quarantine. And I think that's the main thing that we want to talk about, is the ethics of a government-enforced quarantine or authoritative quarantines.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start off with what happened in China, because in China, they are claiming that, at least at the point of recording, they're claiming that no new cases have occurred in China.
Yeah, that
now,
seems unlikely.
it seems unlikely. Also, there have been some reports and rumors of local government officials being told not to report any new cases. Also, for a while, they were only recording new cases if they were people who were traveling from outside of China, to make a claim that, oh, well, there's no one from in China. But the more concerning thing is there have been several videos circulating of Chinese quarantine officials going from apartment building to apartment building, welding the doors shut. So when they say that China cracked down on this and said, yeah, we're going to quarantine everyone, particularly in Wuhan, where this first appeared, they mean we're welding the doors shut, preventing people from getting out. So let's start off with the ethics of that.
Is it right to literally force people to stay inside? I mean, arguably, there are some positives to it. You are pretty much stopping the spread of illness if no one can get out of their home, because the door has been welded shut.
I think it also depends on what level of infection is there. So if you know that in that building there are a large number of people that are infected, if you absolutely cut them off from the rest of society by welding the doors shut, you are protecting the rest of society because you know that those people are infected.
Yeah. So, and I mean, similar things have been done in the past. You know, with the Black Plague, there were cities that were walled off, and people were barred from leaving, and no one could go into the city if they knew that there was sick people in that town, because that, you know, it's like, well, we might as well let the town die because we don't have another option.
And similar things with leprosy, that leper colonies were groups of people that could still live because they were still alive. So let's not kill them. They can still continue functioning for a while. They're just going to be falling apart as time goes on. And so lepers were put into a leper colony to continue helping each other out while they still lived.
Right. And in those cases, the leper colonies still exist today, even though leprosy's been cured. But it's mostly for people that have had some debilitation due to leprosy, because after it's cured, you don't just regrow limbs and things that have fallen off.
Sure. So back to the efficacy or the ethics of locking people in. Let's say that some people are affected inside of the building, but not all of them. By locking them in, you're now condemning the people who are not sick yet, including the people who are sick, and basically saying you're not going to be getting medical help. So it's equivalent in a way to if you have an infected limb that it has gangrene, just chopping off that limb and saying, all right, yeah, the healthy goes with the bad, but I'm doing it to save the whole. And particularly with gangrene, or things like frostbite, you do amputate the part of the body that's problematic. So, in that way, what China was doing in locking people in or welding them in and making sure that they couldn't spread the disease anywhere else was trying to protect the rest of the society. And as we're seeing in a lot of Western nations, it's COVID-19 in particular spreads very, very quickly.
Yep.
So there is arguably an ethical stance there, even if you're locking healthy people in, because when it comes down to it, the numbers are what's important. And if let's say a disease has a 100% kill rate, then you would be very, very encouraged to cut it off as soon as possible because you don't want your entire society to die. If it has a very low kill rate, then the reasonability of completely locking people off and condemning them to death drops off. And I think that there's probably some equation there that no one has actually put down because it's hard to put an equation to ethics.
Yeah. I was going to say actuarial sciences probably have an equation there.
Probably. And I think this is a question that is brought up a lot in zombie movies. If someone gets infected with the zombie virus, they're about to turn. You shoot them first to prevent them from being able to spread the disease. And it seems like that's a well-established fact that if someone gets a zombie virus, it's assumed that it's a 100% conversion ratio, that as soon as you get it, you will succumb to it, you'll die, and then you will start trying to spread the disease. The solution to that is to kill the person before they can spread it. Even if it's your friend or family, that shows up all the time in zombie movies. So the question is, if there's only a % chance of that disease being carried on to another person, what degree? Right. What are the ethics of that? To what degree do you limit the contact with that person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the other part of this is that, like, what if a person is healthy or is asymptomatic and does not show any symptoms, and so they are going to be fine, but they can still spread the disease.
Absolutely. And with COVID-19, that's absolutely the case, where you can be asymptomatic, you can be carrying it and passing it on to people for up to, I think, between 1 and 2 weeks.
I mean, in some cases, there have been reports that people are asymptomatic for the duration of the sickness.
That they can get it and recover from it without showing any symptoms.
Right.
So in that case, it's a somewhat invisible disease, meaning that the entire society could be, anyone in the society can potentially infect anyone else. So under those circumstances, which is what we're in right now, the response for basically every government throughout the world is tell people to stay at home or force them to stay at home to make sure that there's no opportunity for them to pass it on, and give us time to find a way of fighting the disease. It sounds like the purpose of the quarantine is not to stop the spread. It's to slow the spread enough that we can find a way of fighting it.
Right. Slows the spread while we work on solutions. There are that need to be researched. There are reports that a lot of the governments are putting a lot of money into finding a cure for it or a vaccine for it, because
or finding ways of treating it.
Right. Yeah. Just treatments in general. I mean, beyond just the limited ventilators that the world has.
And ventilators, for something that people may not realize, if you go onto a ventilator, from what we're seeing at the time of recording, if you go onto a ventilator, there is, in most cases, a more than 50% chance that you will still die even while trying to come off of the ventilator.
Yeah.
That the ventilator shortage is just for the most extreme. It's for the most extreme cases where people are right on the edge of death. And even if you do survive, that less than 50% that do survive, you're in many cases in a wheelchair and need major medical care moving forward to be able to recover from the disease. And that's assuming that you don't have permanent lung damage, which in many cases you do.
Yep. Yeah. Ventilator is not like a cure-all. This is, if you're about to die, this is going to prolong your life, hopefully long enough to save you, and then you possibly might still die from being on the ventilator itself.
Right. And that is in comparison to drugs like hydroxychloroquine, which at the time of recording, and again, things are constantly changing right now, but the studies that have been going on are pointing to hydroxychloroquine potentially being able to drastically shorten and stop the course of the disease. So that is a way of actually not just sustaining you, but actually reversing the direction of the course of the
Hmm.
disease.
Right.
So again, to bring it back to the topic at hand is we're trying to buy time to slow the spread to prevent as many people from dying so that we can get a cure or a way of treating it to reduce the lethality of the disease.
And well, so let's say that is we mentioned before, self isolation. When a government says everyone should self isolate, that is a like it's kind of you're saying, hey, people, it is your responsibility. There isn't so much enforcement going on when you are barring and welding the doors shut. That is forced isolation,
Yeah.
and it's not so much self isolation. You in your apartment building are isolated. Um,
Well, and so one of the other things that goes along with that is the idea of, do we give complete control over what happens to the society to the government, or do we give control over what happens to the society to the people? Because it
mhm,
seems like in authoritarian countries like China, the government says, this is what we're planning on doing. The society will uh, abide by our decisions, whether they like it or not, and it will be done
mhm,
through military force. Meanwhile, in Western countries, whether that be Italy, France, Spain, the US, the orders are you should shelter in place, and you are strongly encouraged to shelter in place, or self isolate, but it's not being enforced strictly, which
mhm,
means the government is setting out the example of here's what you should be doing to protect the society, but people are
right.
still able to vote with their actions and say, I'm going to do this, or I know what you're saying I should do, but it is still up to
Mhm.
me to choose what I want to do.
Yeah, and I mean, to an extent, I think, in at least in the U.S., there are orders in place that say no, like no non-essential businesses can be running, no groups of more than 10 people can happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if a person is part of that, they need to break it up. I don't know what really happens if a, a group of people is found, other
A
than
couple
like
of
that.
people have been arrested for breaching the small gathering orders.
Mm,
I don't know what they've been charged with or what degree of crime they've been charged with, but there have been in the U.S. at least a couple of arrests for having gatherings that were too large.
mm. Yeah. I mean, and with good reason. There have been multiple cases in the West, at least, about like pastors and church sermons happening, like pastors saying, "No, nope, we're still having church because
Mm-hmm.
we believe it required by our religion," and then like tens of people get the disease. And I think in one case I heard about there was like 150 people that got the disease, and like 14 of them ended up dying from a sermon in Spain
Mm-hmm. And
because the pastor was like, we're gonna still have church."
that's a problem with rigid ideologies that don't take into account the transmission of disease. That germ theory is only a couple hundred years old, whereas religions are thousands of years old in many cases.
Mhm.
So when if religions were developed and the policies were developed before we had an idea of how diseases spread and realizing that this isn't a curse, it doesn't
Right.
matter if you've been good or bad, you can still get it. It's a matter of hygiene and not how
Yeah.
nice you are as a person.
Right.
Um, it's something that we as a people need to start saying we need to update these old rules to take into account new knowledge. And that's something
Mhm.
that, particularly in religious structures, those tend to be very rigid structures and can be
Right.
problematic in examples like quarantine of we're not going to quarantine ourselves because that goes against our religion, in which case those people are now more at risk from a scientific perspective. But as part of religious freedom, if you are in a free state, should those individuals have the right to put themselves at a greater risk?
I think that there is some like there is a certain I guess lessening of rights that can and should happen in cases like this. Like people people like individuals can be smart, but people as a whole are dumb. And populations as a whole.
Persons are smart, people are dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on that, it's like there are a lot of people that don't realize the bigger stakes in any situation. They don't know, they don't, maybe they aren't fully informed. They're not getting the information that they need, or they think,
But that's in almost
I'm
every
definitely not
single
safe.
situation. That
Yeah.
that pe- y- we try to educate people on how to be safe, for instance, wearing seatbelts, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But you can't educate everyone, particularly because there's a difference in how intelligent people are. You can't educate everyone to the same
Mhm.
degree and have everyone be perfectly safe. And also, being safe, being as safe as physically possible means that you just don't do anything. By
Right.
doing things that are meaningful, you are putting yourself in danger. You need to find a balance between what level of danger you are okay with exposing yourself to, and that choice is up to the
Mhm.
individual unless you're in an authoritarian state, in which case that choice is left to whatever the governing body is.
Mhm. I mean, but thinking about it, like, why are like in that sense, um, thinking about anything that is illegal, why are drugs illegal? Because we've had this discussion, but like if we say this is illegal because we believe, like we as a government or we as a people believe that it is overall a negative influence,
Mm-hmm.
how is that different than saying we're making drugs illegal versus we're making large social gatherings illegal?
Sure. And building off of the conversation that we had on drugs in a previous episode, we seemed to agree that people should be able to do drugs as long as they are not affecting those around them. And if they are affecting
Mhm.
those around them, then they can be punished to a greater degree based on the drugs that they're taking and whether or not they are putting themselves in a more susceptible position. So it could be somewhere along the lines of you should protect yourself. So
Mhm.
in the current circumstances, you should protect yourself by only going outside when it's necessary, as in like to the store or going for a walk and going around other people. You should only do that when it's absolutely necessary. But if you do it, you're putting yourself at risk. Now,
Right.
if you catch it and then you're still going out and around people, assuming that that order and recommendation is in place, the only people that are going out are the ones that are viewing it as critical and are taking the risk upon themselves. And so they're choosing to put themselves in harm's way. So
Mhm.
anyone that dies during a self isolation suggestion, their deaths are on their hands.
Yeah, but but in the situation where they are asymptomatic and they are fine, but they go out, they either catch it or they pass it along to people, and they catch it. They say asymptomatic, go home to maybe where maybe they have a more susceptible, more likely to die, and they end up dying. Is that person's death on their hands? Should they be responsible and held responsible for basically taking the life of their loved one because they went out and took the risk upon themselves? And really, what that meant is taking the risk upon themselves and those around them.
So that's a great point is to what degree are individuals responsible for the individuals around them? So if I am responsible for taking care of someone, let's say I have a sick mother that she can't really go out and do many things on her own. I need to frequently help her out with things. If I put myself in harm's way and then I go help her and she's dependent on me, now I'm
Mhm.
putting her at risk.
Right.
So I have a responsibility, at least an ethical responsibility and probably a moral responsibility to take care of her and protect her by protecting myself, which means
Hmm.
that I should be following the orders and the recommendations. But, and this is a big but, that's assuming that the orders and recommendations come from a valid perspective. If an authoritarian government decides we are going to quarantine people because we feel like quarantining them, they can do that for any reason. If
Right.
it's because you pose a threat of health against other people, if I say you have a personality type that I believe is dangerous to the health and well-being of other individuals, that opens the door to religious prosecution. If I hold the opinion, and let's say I'm an authoritarian person that says, I believe that all Muslims are a risk to everyone else in their society and they should be quarantined and they should be put into concentration camps, calling out on China. If that's the perspective, and we say, oh, we're just quarantining them so that they don't hurt other people, we're still letting them live, but just lived in quarantine, that's justifiable. If you say that people that are putting others at risk can be quarantined, then as a blanket governmental decision, you run the risk of all forms of prosecution. So in that way, quarantines
in that
are.
sense.
Go ahead.
What's the difference between quarantine and jailing someone for like committing a crime?
I think that's probably where the biggest difference is jailing someone is for an action that they did. Quarantining someone is for their current state of health that can be transmitted without their intention. Is that a fair distinction?
I think that's a fair distinction, yeah.
Okay. So then let's leave aside things that are people's choices. There is still a choice involved in sickness, that if you go out, you choose to put yourself in positions that may make you more likely to catch the disease. Therefore, while it is a disease that you could be passing on, which would fall under the quarantine metric, you have made a choice about that, which falls under the jailing metric.
Right. So in that sense, I mean, if people as a whole, if society as a whole has proven that they are not, willing to self-isolate, is it right to, force quarantine, basically jail people into their apartment buildings to prevent the spread?
Right. And I think it comes down to what the society or what individuals with power decide is the best method for moving forward as a society. If you believe that the decisions need to be left up to the individual, then even if the individual is putting other people at risk, they are putting themselves at risk primarily, and it's their choice. If you want to have a government set up that can take authoritarian measures and force everyone to self-isolate, then you're putting your faith in the fact that those in authority have the best interest of the society at heart, and that they are only acting in the best interest of the society, which means you're putting the actual literal lives of everyone in the society in the hands of a few people. So it really comes down to, do you believe in authoritarianism or freedom? In the scenarios of freedom, so in Western societies, and this is going to be a really big if here, if the numbers from China, as an example of as an example of an authoritarian regime, if the numbers of from China are to be believed, they are much, much lower and more controlled than the numbers in Western nations, because Western nations are not taking authoritarian measures, or at least to the same degree. So the numbers will be higher, which means that more people will be infected and more people will die in free societies.
It is your right to die.
It is your right to choose to live a dangerous way and die, rather than be forced to live under the foot of a government, but potentially live longer.
Right.
But it basically means that the individual is completely, has no rights and has no meaning to the state. It's just statistics and people that can be used to serve the purpose of the state. Because if you have a state that is authoritarian, people don't exist for their own self-benefit. They exist for the betterment of the state. And that's it.
Right. Yep.
So it really does come down to, are quarantines okay? Are government-ordered quarantines acceptable when people are asymptomatic? It comes down to, do you believe that the state should have complete authority over your life? And if you don't, or if you believe that people should be free to make their own decisions and put themselves at risk, then No, you should not have a quarantine with asymptomatic individuals. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I mean,
Now, I added the qualifier of
yeah,
with asymptomatic individuals. So what
right.
about symptomatic individuals?
If someone, goes out and does things while they know they're sick, but they believe that it's COVID. Like, yeah, it's just allergy season. It's and my allergies may not normally manifest like this, but it's allergy season.
Sure. How about this? Let's take an extreme example. Let's say someone has some uh, ooh, smallpox.
Yeah.
So for reference, smallpox I believe was eradicated as of 1973. That it was the first disease to be labeled as eradicated. There has not been a case since then. And the reason that the world took such drastic measures to eliminate smallpox is because of how horrific it was. For reference,
Mhm.
if smallpox is incredibly contagious, you can pass it on to a dozen or so people before um, you either die or people realize to stay away from you.
Mhm.
So very, very virulent. Uh, the kill rate is approximately 30%. If you get smallpox, there's about a 30% chance that you die. Of the remaining 2/3, there is a 50% chance that you go blind
Mhm.
because of the scars. It can affect the eyes. So there's about a 1/3 chance that you can get out of it with having some scars, and there's about a 1/3 chance that you go blind and a 1/3 chance that you die. Horrific disease, but it
Right.
was eradicated. Let When I say eradicated, I mean it is gone from the natural world. It still exists in uh, a couple of specific locations in testing facilities to make sure that if it does come back, that we have a way of testing those strains. Uh, there's been some debate on whether or not those should be destroyed, but let's say that someone shows up and they have smallpox.
Mhm.
Should that person just be forced to be quarantined, put in a room, and even if no one is willing to go in to give them treatment, should that person just be locked in that room until they die and then burn the room? Because that is something with a very high kill rate, that is a very horrific disease, that is
Mhm.
very virulent. And if it gets back out into society, it's very likely that millions of people will die.
Right.
And in that case, it's an extreme case, but locking a person in a room, killing them, and burning them may actually be a morally valid thing to do because you're protecting millions of people.
Mhm. And I mean, this is the kill rate and the of kill rate of COVID is not quite as high, but it still does mean potentially millions of deaths. I mean, there are already tens of thousands of deaths
Mm-hmm.
in the world from this, and that the projections say that we are not at peak deaths yet.
And
Like the
it
number
seems
of
to
new
be that
cases,
the
the number of deaths per day is increasing
right,
every
and it
day.
seems to be that the death rate is around 2 to 2.5% if you have medical facilities that can care for people that can recover from it. If you
Right.
don't have those medical facilities, that may go up to about 6 or 7% from what we've seen.
Hmm.
And it's also weird because it's very skewed with population age. So
Right.
if you're in your 20s, it's similar to maybe the flu of zero point 0.1 or 0.5%. But if you're over 60 or over 70, your likelihood of dying is on the order of 20 to 30%.
Hmm.
So it's very skewed towards the upper age limits. And in that case, should we just say elderly people need to quarantine because they are very, very at risk? So you are at risk individuals. Those individuals cannot leave and can be arrested and or forced to be under house arrest or something along those lines. So forcing people to live in a way that does not put them at great risk while the
Hmm.
rest of society goes on.
Yeah, but who's caring for those individuals?
And that's a great question, particularly individuals that can't live on their own and need to
Hmm.
are in assisted living homes. Now, if you're in assisted living, you already can't generally leave anyway, so you're already in a way quarantined. I'm talking about
Hmm.
the people who are old but still have autonomy, can still drive places on their own, can still walk places on their own, should their choice to travel be removed, assuming that critical things like food, water, and supplies are still provided to them in some way?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, just because someone has a compromised immune system doesn't mean that they are unable to take care for themselves otherwise.
Right. And if they have a compromised immune system, but they say, I am not okay, I would rather live dangerously than and live short than live long and live safely. That
Mhm.
if they want to go out and see their family members and they're like, well, I may die in the next couple of years anyway. I want to continue seeing my family and I don't want to spend the rest of my life in quarantine. If they're putting themselves at risk because they're an at risk population, it's their right to do that if you believe that humans have a right to autonomy. China
Right.
obviously doesn't.
Yeah.
Now, along those lines, what responsibility do we have to the aging population, again, in the case of COVID 19, compared to the economy? Because one of the biggest
Hmm.
concerns is that the economy is tanking worldwide because
Yeah.
businesses are just shutting down. They're stopping. Commerce is stopping. And it's the first time, personally, it's the first time in my life where the world has quite literally just screeched to a halt.
Yeah. I mean, that is literally what's happened is people, like, as a whole, like the populate, like the individuals may be healthy and able to do things, but the risk to society as a health has basically caused society to stop. We have
Mm-hmm.
banned, well, maybe banned slash barred or heavily discouraged large groups of people meeting. We have just shut down so many businesses, saying, "Nope, you cannot run for the time being," and like it is hitting every society. Like,
A lot of businesses are closing down, as in going bankrupt.
mhm,
Businesses that will likely just leave a hole in the market. A lot of travel has been shut down, either saying no flights will go between these countries or no one is permitted to go between these countries. And most countries have, as far as I know, most countries have shut down their border at this point.
yeah.
Of the only travel that's going between might be the trade of goods, where there are a few people on a ship that are just transporting physical materials, and
Mhm.
that's about it. There's no travel by choice, and folks that are abroad, I know in the U.S., people are being told, if you're abroad right now, come back now because you may not be able to get back in the next few weeks.
Yeah. And I think that that actually has already passed. I think for the most part, if they didn't make it home recently, they probably aren't going to be home for a while.
Mm-hmm. And I was personally affected by this. I was going to be traveling out of the country, and I was supposed to leave about 1 week ago, and that was right when the quarantine was starting to peak, or at least when things were ramping up, stay in place orders were being rolled out, and I thought, I may not be able to actually get a flight back to the U.S. and I may be stuck. And now, looking a week later, it sounds like that concern was validated, and I didn't
Hmm.
go traveling because of the risks of being stuck in that other country.
Correct. Yeah. And I
But that
think,
but that was a
I mean,
choice that I made. But I had
right.
still had the freedom to choose that. The flight was
Hmm.
still going out. I chose not to go onto it, even though I did try calling the airline. They were so busy that their automatic phone call handling
Hmm.
was erroring out, and I couldn't get a hold of someone, so I was never able to actually cancel the flight, which means I may just be out the cost. But that's the degree to which I was comfortable with not traveling.
Yeah.
I'm willing to forego that cost if it means not being stuck in that other country. But other people, if they wanted to take that risk, I think it's up to them to take that risk, and it should be up to the individual
Right.
and up to the country that says, hey, we're still going to be having flights. It's a risk that we view as acceptable.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you had the right, but that was you. I think that right has, for the most part, been taken away for the
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Yeah.
So. There was a time of limited right, or there was a time of full rights, but an urging
Mm-hmm.
to not make use of them, and that has shifted to
Sure.
just don't. You can't anymore.
Now let's take, because this is the government saying this is what you should do. If the quarantine is long enough, it starts to give the ability to have a referendum and say everyone in the country needs to give their opinion on this, vote on whether or not we should have a government mandated and legally enforced quarantine. If it goes long enough, that you obviously, in diseases like this, you need to act quickly. So taking wartime measures or emergency measures for the short-term reaction, but in the long-term reaction, some people are saying, this quarantine may go on for months or to be completely effective. And depending on how long it takes to get a vaccine, if it's possible, it may take years.
Right.
So at a certain point, should you start saying we should have a vote and ask
When
people?
does life get to continue?
Right. And this is part of the argument against having a vote is, number one, you have to go to voting locations, which means, there's a disease that we don't want to spread. Let's all go to a single location, one after another, with lines of people, putting everyone in close proximity to vote on whether or not we should allow people to get close to each other and go back into lines. It kind of defeats the purpose. That being said, if you believe that voting is the correct solution and that people should be able to choose their own destiny, then the quarantine should be a strongly suggested quarantine and not legally enforced, so that people can say, I am very strongly suggested to do this, and it is socially unacceptable for me to be going out for non-essential and non-critical purposes, and I'm still going out. That's still up to me, and I think that the best way to do it is probably just be socially enforced, that the government can suggest it. If people want to adopt that as a social rule, then they can, and socially shun the people that aren't following that rule. But because it necessarily infringes on the rights of the individuals, in countries where the rights of the individuals are valuable, quarantines of society-wide quarantines, including those of healthy people, it should be a choice, and people vote on whether or not they agree with that choice and to what degree they're comfortable with it by acting. They vote with their feet.
Yeah. Arguably, that is still the case in most of the U.S. People can still go out and still, vote with their actions, as you said earlier.
And that's a capitalistic perspective, that people vote with their actions. And on the flip side,
and it's less capitalistic than democratic.
The reason I say capitalistic is, with businesses, the best, if you go to a business, you can write reviews and you can put those online, or you can put them in newspapers, wherever you want. You can write reviews, or you can vote with your feet. If you don't go there, they're less likely to survive as a business.
Right.
So that's what I mean by voting with your feet. It's very similar to how capitalism functions, as opposed to, again, with China, communism, the state decides this is what people will do, this is what this group of people will do, and we will take measures to make sure that you will comply with what we believe to be the best action. So if you believe that it should be okay to have a quarantine that is enforced legally and not just suggested and socially enforced, then you are an authoritarian. Japan is an interesting example to bring up at this point, because they have a social norm that if you are sick, wear a mask. A mask is very unlikely to prevent you from getting sick, because if you get particles or viruses or bacteria on the mask, you're likely to then touch the mask, and then you have it on your hands, and it will probably then get everywhere else on your body, because you touch your face a lot more than you think you do.
Yeah.
So Japan has... Go ahead.
Yeah. Masks more prevent the spread to other people.
Exactly. If you are sick, you don't want to get other people sick. So wearing masks is something that is socially encouraged in Japan. Interestingly, in the US, if you're wearing a mask, it's a lot of people will assume, oh, you're sick and you're near me. And I've heard examples of people where person A is wearing a mask, person B is not wearing a mask, and both of them are coughing. And someone will complain to the person wearing a mask saying, what are you doing wearing a mask? Why are you out here in public? While not complaining about the person that's having a coughing fit right next to them. I've heard firsthand examples of that happening,
Right.
which is a perfect example of stupidity of some people and just the social stigma around wearing a mask. Wearing a mask, oh, you must be really contagious and you are a person I should avoid, as opposed to the people who you really should avoid, which are the people who are coughing and not covering their mouths or not wearing a mask.
Yeah.
So Japan as a culture has decided masks are socially encouraged, and it is a sign of courtesy that you're wearing a mask because you're obviously trying to prevent the spread of diseases. Whereas in a lot of other Western nations, the stigma is if you're wearing a mask, it's because you are sick, and it's bad if you're wearing a mask because it's bad that you're sick.
Right.
So let's say the U.S. wants to adopt the social stigma or the social norm of wearing a mask in public if you think that you may get other people sick. Could it be legally mandated in a free society to wear a mask regardless of whether or not you're sick? In an instance like this where we know that you can be asymptomatic, can people be legally forced to wear masks?
I mean, yes. I think rightfully it should come down to a vote of the people, I think
that
vote of actions, I guess.
That's something that wearing a mask does not prevent you from doing something. Like you can still go out, you can still interact with people. You may have to remove the mask to be able to kiss people, but kissing is something that is generally accepted to be a bi-directional permission. So requiring people to wear a mask does not infringe on their rights. It does somewhat limit what you can do, or at least it's something that's going on your face. But
no
it is for
other people's faces.
Right. It's for the protection of other people, and your rights end where another person's rights begin. So another person's rights to be able to stay healthy are where your rights end of, well, you want to stay healthy, they want to stay healthy. If you are actively endangering them, you're infringing on their rights, which is where the idea of a government-enforced quarantine comes from. But a mask does not prevent you from doing basically anything that you want to do, but it does help prevent the spread of disease from people who are infected to those who are not infected. That's also the type of thing that can be. The vote comes from, in particular, if you have a republic where you vote people in that you want them to represent you, those individuals are currently in power. So you can have a mandate of, oh, you go out, you have a mask, and that's legally required. The people in power are the ones that can choose whether or not to enact that law. And if you disagree with that, you can then vote someone else in so that the time that you're affected by it is limited by the election period, essentially.
Yeah.
That still gives the power to the people.
Right. This is true.
That being said, it increases the time to which you're susceptible to the disease, or your society is susceptible to the disease, meaning that you may, as a society, still take the damage.
Yeah.
So another question that's been brought up is, let's say that 3% is the kill rate, and if it affects the medical system to a large degree, meaning that more people will die that get the disease as well as some other people that can't get care because the hospitals are overrun. Let's say it has a 5% kill rate. And let's look at the extremes. You can either stop the economy completely and do what you can to save those 5% and maybe get it down to 2%, which seems to be the kill rate with proper medical care. Or you can say, let the 5% die, because most of the people that are dying are those that are already have medical issues. So if you are elderly, if you have diabetes, if you're overweight,
Hmm.
if you have breathing problems, if you have immune deficiencies, I believe those are the primary criteria that put you at risk for COVID-19. Those are people
Yep.
who are already weak, at least in terms of they are at risk already in terms of sickness. And for the elderly, a lot of them are going to be retired, or the people that are most susceptible are retired, meaning that they are not contributing much to society. So
Hmm.
tanking the society and tanking the economy for the sake of those individuals that aren't contributing and are largely sapping off of the society, what obligation does the rest of society have to them? If we as a whole decide we should continue and let our economy recover at the sacrifice of those individuals,
Hmm.
we're not killing those individuals. We are letting nature take its course on those individuals, meaning, yeah, we're going to lose 5% of the population, but it's a 5% of the population that already wasn't that productive in the first place. And we're able to restart our economy.
Right. How much of the lose to recover the economy?
Right. And what percent are we comfortable with doing that? Now, this is a unique scenario because it primarily affects the elderly. And those
Hmm.
are people that the economy can lose without taking much of a hit. And actually, for instance, healthcare systems would benefit from not having elderly individuals in the health pool,
Right.
because they're
It's
the
almost yeah. It's almost as if someone didn't like if this disease had been created by someone. It's almost as if they were targeting the elderly with it.
yeah. Is there a country out there somewhere with an aging population that doesn't have enough young people to take care of it because of a one-child policy, and it would really benefit the country to lose all of their elderly people so that they could
Hmm.
start moving on with their society and get rid of the burden? Ah,
Yeah, I don't know
China,
if anything like that
China.
exists. You have a cough there? Are you wearing a mask?
I might have the COVID. I might have the
Oh,
corona.
oh.
Sorry, Winnie the flu.
Yeah. I mean, no, I guess one rebuttal to your statement that losing elderly people isn't going to affect the economy. Think about who is in charge of most governments.
Yeah, yeah, and almost all governments are led by elderly people.
Hmm.
And Iran is a perfect example of this. Is COVID-19 swept through the Iranian government, which many countries would think is a good thing, because if you have an aging population that is remaining in power through authoritarian or
Hmm.
dictatorial means, that getting those people out may be a good thing, draining the swamp, if you will.
Yeah.
So it can give a refresher, and as with anything in nature, the old needs to die to make way for the new.
Hmm.
And we see this in forest fires, that if a forest, well, California is experiencing this. A lot of people don't realize that they are kind of causing their own problems by actively preventing forest fires and even stopping natural forest fires that are starting. It is causing more deadwood to be built up, so that eventually the fire is not containable, and
Yeah.
the severity of the fire is much, much, much worse. And so
Yep.
as healthcare improves in modern society, that means that there are going to be a lot more people that are on the edge of death. That
Hmm.
as we get more and more people that live into their 80s, yeah, you're 80, you're still alive, which is more than what can be said from 50 years ago,
Hmm.
but you are more susceptible to diseases. So when a disease hits, you are less capable of holding it, and that means that we may have a lot of people die because you're old. And I think that that's
Yep.
exactly what we're seeing with COVID-19. Is we are artificially
We
creating a bunch of dead wood that's ready to burn, and now we're freaking out that it's burning.
Yep. Just because one errant spark decided to blaze all of these old people.
Right, the old people are burning.
All
But
right. So Yep, we have started. All of the old people are burning, and we're desperately trying to put out the massive piles of them.
And that's actually accurate. Is
Yeah.
cremation sites are filled, like they are. It was seen in China. Crematoriums, that's the word. Crematoriums were running 24/7,
Mhm.
and at rates that were higher than what China was reporting. That if you look at how long they were running and what that throughput means, it's higher than the death toll numbers that were being
Yeah.
officially reported from China.
Well, they just want to get rid of all the dead wood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
It's
And
like
you,
these
you
people, they were at risk for corona. They were going to probably die anyways. Might as
well,
well throw them in there.
well, and they're learning from the Nazis that if you burn the evidence, no one will know.
Right.
So going back to more reasonable discussion, as we are having better and better healthcare, we're able to keep people on the edge of death more. If we suddenly have something that is new, novel, like the coronavirus,
hmm
that pushes a bunch of those people over the edge, we should still work to learn how to cope with that and learn how to prevent additional elderly people from dying, to continue pushing the age limit of humans forward and longer and longer and longer. But for those individuals that are right on the edge already, if this disease had hit 100 years ago, it would not be nearly as bad as hitting now, because
I
100 years
mean,
ago the
look at the
population
Spanish
did.
flu.
So yes, but the Spanish flu affected everyone.
Right.
It also had a high kill rate in the young population. This is very
Mhm.
different because in the aging population, they are the ones that are more at risk, and like more at risk by a factor of 100.
Right.
If you go
It's
from
true.
a 20-year-old to a 70-year-old, you're hundreds of times more likely to die from this,
Mhm.
if you're in the second group. So it's, in a way, with COVID-19 specifically, it's an artificially created dead wood forest that is now burning. And
Mhm.
as a society, most governments are panicking and saying we can't just let people die,
Mhm.
even though it's an artificially created problem. We've given people the benefit of living longer lives,
Mhm.
but in this case, nature has stepped in and we've lost the ability to continue that life forward. That's not condemning them to death. It's nature taking its course and
Yeah.
us still doing what we can, but not condemning the lives of everyone else in the society by tanking the economy.
Mhm.
So that's another argument for allowing people to be in a suggested quarantine rather than an enforced quarantine in this example, is that the people that are being affected are an artificially created, I don't want to say artificially created, but the aged population is
Mhm.
there because we have gained knowledge on how to deal with illness. This is a new illness that we haven't been able to deal with, so those people will die according to the natural law of
Mhm.
to natural laws. It's a problem that we would not have had if this disease popped up 100 years ago.
Yep. So if I was a person in my 20s and I chose to go outside right now and just keep hanging around, I can just claim I'm just trying to help burn the dead wood.
Yeah, and that is, it's a fair claim that you are
Mhm.
trying to burn the deadwood. Most people won't understand what you mean. If you say, "Oh, I'm talking about burning people," I don't think that you're going to get a positive reaction.
Yeah. Smokey Bear was wrong in this case, guys. Come on. Let's burn the old people.
But that is a lesson that's being learned in California with the forest fires. That the forest
Right.
fires are getting worse because of such drastic measures to prevent forest fires. That's not to say that you should go out and intentionally start forest fires. That's arson.
Right. But
But
if a natural one occurs, you should do what you can to limit, monetary loss, but
mhm.
it is good for the ecosystem because I mean,
Well, and
forests can recover from small forest fires. When major ones happen, it takes a lot longer also.
right, and there are controlled burns where you intentionally burn certain areas that do have a lot of deadwood built up so that the forest can recycle itself. And forest fires are a natural part of the forest cycle. So that is something that we're doing, is controlled burns. This seems to, the COVID-19 disease seems to be like the type of thing where it could be a controlled burn, where you try to limit the spread, which by saying, socially enforced, wear masks to try to prevent the spread of the disease. People who are particularly at risk, you are strongly encouraged to self-isolate. You should protect yourself. You shouldn't be going out unless you need to.
Yep.
To give time to be able to get back up to the point of, we can take care of everyone into their 80s. Oh, wait, now we can only take care of them into their 50s because of this disease. Give time to extend that out again through social measures, but so that it's a controlled burn. But I'm trying to think of the continue the correlation to a forest fire. There's no correlation to really quarantining a forest. You can't do it.
I mean, you can build like moats and ditches.
Sure, dig a ditch between every tree.
Well, I mean, you can dig a ditch between forests. I mean, that definitely happens. They dig ditches so that the fire can only spread so far, and then it's controlled burn on one side while saving the other.
Sure, and that's equivalent to welding the doors shut.
Right.
But what I'm thinking is limiting the spread of the burn while we try to figure out how to deal with it, but not necessarily. And this is where the analogy with the forest fire kind of breaks down. With the elderly population, do you sacrifice the entire economy and the well-being of those that are not as susceptible to keep those folks alive? And if you are an authoritarian government that believes, yes, we should do that, and we are going to lock down hard and infringe on the rights of the individuals, okay, then you are an authoritarian, and whatever you say goes. That's your opinion. Congratulations, you are closer to God than the rest of us. But in free societies, the thing to do is those that are susceptible, you give stronger suggestions to and implement it as a social norm and what is socially acceptable. But you really can't make laws in a free society to limit the travel of people, and if you are not infected. If you are infected and you're going out, so if you're actively showing symptoms and it's easy to tell that you are putting other people at risk, that's a completely different question. I think in that case, you are actively endangering other people, and you can have legal ramifications.
I mean, what if the society itself discourages people from staying home and by limiting sick days and things like that?
That's a socially enforced thing that everyone can choose to agree to, and it's not a government mandated thing. Right. When I say government mandated, I mean a few individuals making a decision for everyone in the society, as opposed to, for instance, companies and how many sick days you want to give. That's a company by company choice, and so you can go to different spots in the country or to different companies to choose what rules you want to live by.
Yeah, I mean, and there are. Yeah, that's a topic for another time, but in the U.S. at least, the societal expectation is that, and this has been mostly set by companies, that hey, if you are sick, you can only be sick so much per year, so it doesn't matter if you get really sick. If you're still sick, you need to come in.
I don't think that's valid. I think what usually happens is you start taking unpaid time off.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not that you have to start coming in, it's you have to take unpaid time off. But it depends on the company, whatever their policy is.
I mean, and you're assuming a salary there. If you're hourly and you take time off, you take a sick day, you aren't getting paid for that day.
Right. And so, those are social norms, but social norms are things that people can or can't can agree to or not, depending on what they want, and they can go to different social groups depending on what rules they want to follow. So there is more freedom of choice for socially enforced rules rather than governmental enforced rules, which is a few people delegating the rules for everyone else.
Hmm.
So it again comes down to authoritarian versus non-authoritarian, and it's a question that one of the questions that I wanted to bring up is with the U.S. the First Amendment is freedom of speech, but also freedom of peaceable assembly, and that is number one. You need to be able to freely, peaceably assemble. And this is a perfect, like, quarantines are a perfect example of that. If you can't protest the quarantine that you're under, you have no rights. Because if you can't express your desires and if you can't express your rights, then you have no rights. So a quarantine in that
Arguably,
way.
people can assemble, just not physically. These days, you can assemble very well without ever leaving your house.
True, but
How?
that drastically limits your ability to assemble.
Right. Yeah.
And that means that it is people that have to be technologically savvy. If the central location for where the government operates, I need to be able to go there and express my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that is literally the number one and most important amendment in the U.S. Constitution is the freedom of speech and peaceable assembly. And if you are in quarantine or if there's a quarantine and you can't express, if the people can't express their distaste for the quarantine, then no one has any rights whatsoever. And in that way, a
Unless they have a
quarantine,
gun.
which is the Second Amendment. So in that way, quarantines that are legally enforced to the point of you are no longer allowed to peaceably assemble for the purpose of protest is no longer valid under the U.S. Constitution. I think from a logical perspective, that seems sound to me.
Mm-hmm. So arguably, I think we've seen this a lot in the past in the U.S. and in a lot of Western countries. There is a certain limitation to what is freedom of speech and freedoms in general, and the ability to have those taken away in the short term in order to help preserve the long term uh, ability to have those rights. So, taking for example, like uh, you yeah, when September 11th 2001 occurred and the World Trade Centers were taken down, as well as several other actions, there was a lot of question of, okay, we need to infringe on people's rights to prevent this again, and that was generally socially accepted.
Isn't
And
that
in
also what helped push the Patriot Act forward, which
exactly.
is still in place almost 20 years later?
Right. Exactly. And that's kind of what I'm getting to is I think that it is there is danger to infringing on rights, but there needs to be some set way out of it. With the Patriot Act, it was like, we're going to put this into place for the immediate, but we're not going to really set time limit on it. It's just going to be there now.
Exactly.
Um,
And
but
it's a perfect example of if you allow people in power to take authoritarian reactions that infringe directly on the rights of individuals or on the rights of groups of individuals, it is almost impossible to reverse those actions.
so it needs to be
And
from the start and automatic, some kind of reversal built into the system.
and it what was I lost my train of thought. Even if there is a reversal, so as an example, the president of the U.S. has power to declare war for as long as it's I think less than 60 days. After 60 days, the Congress needs to approve of the actions of whether or not we continue the war.
Mm.
That gives the president the ability to act quickly in times of need and times of emergency. So that could be similar of, okay, a quarantine can be enacted for a given amount of time, and after that, Congress needs to get together and come to a full agreement on it.
Mm-hmm.
And if Congress does decide on a quarantine and a majority of the population disagrees with that, then they can vote in new people to change those laws. And the Second Amendment then protects their rights of protest of, if the government says, hey, we're quarantining you and it's based on our choice and we're not holding elections because that would cause everyone to go to the polling agencies and since you're in quarantine, you can't vote. That takes away people's rights. And if people feel so strongly that they end up revolting, the Second Amendment protects people's ability to revolt against the government, which is why we have the Second Amendment. That's one of the primary reasons that we have the Second Amendment, is for things exactly like this. If the quarantine becomes a power grab by the Congress, and the Congress decides you are not going to vote because you're in quarantine and we need to protect people, then an overthrow of the government may be necessary for the people to regain the power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for a strictly enforced quarantine, again, assuming that it is enforced with law.
Yeah. I mean, and there are certain cases, there's certain aspects of this that are enforced with law.
And a quarantine is a good example of, if you give an inch, a mile may be taken. Sorry, if you give a centimeter, a kilometer may be taken. That if authoritarians are permitted to get their foot in the door, they will walk through the door.
Right.
And I think that that's the concern that the founding fathers of the U.S. had, of we need to limit the power of government as much as physically possible, or as much as theoretically possible, to prevent things like this from happening, or prevent power grabs like the Patriot Act.
Right.
And I think that having strong suggestions from the government is perfectly fine. Having legal requirements for people who are unaffected by a virus and are not actively putting anyone in danger to their knowledge. So if I'm infected but I don't know about it, I am not intentionally putting anyone else at risk. If I'm sick and I go out while a measure is in place to say, hey, there's a really dangerous disease out there. If you're sick and showing symptoms, you can't go to these locations. Here's what you need to do. Then you may be able to reasonably face legal ramifications. But if under normal circumstances, a person would be able to function normally and isn't putting anyone else at risk to their knowledge, there should be no legal backing to a quarantine. Other than socially acceptable things to do. You can socially shun people. That's completely different than having legal backing.
Yep. This is true.
Well, we covered quite a few topics, everything from burning old people like dead wood to socially encouraged masks. I think we covered most of the topics, at least that are in particular relevant to the coronavirus, COVID-19, Winnie the flu, the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus, whatever you want to call it. I think I said enough to get us demonetized. Oh wait, we're not monetized. So I think that covers all the points that I wanted to bring up. Do you have any others?
No, I don't think so.
Sounds good. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll hopefully see you guys next time.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.